June 1940, France's surrender, Paris occupation, the rise of Free France. In the early morning of June 14, 1940, a light mist hovered over the Seine River in Paris. In the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, German soldiers marched toward the tower's base, Nazi flags slung over their shoulders. Just 4 days earlier, the French government had declared Paris an open city, a desperate move to spare the capital from destruction. By dawn, 1.5 million Parisians had flooded the highways leading out of the city, their luggage stacked on cars and horse-drawn carts. Some clutched family heirloom oil paintings, others held tight to pet dogs, and most gripped crumpled maps, yet few knew where they would finally find shelter. Across the English Channel, in a small office in London, a French general named Charles de Gaulle stood before a microphone. His voice, rough with resolve, cut through the smoke of war. France is not defeated. This was June 1940, the darkest month of World War II for France, when the fall of one city and the kindling of a resistance flame unfolded simultaneously. The streets of Paris, once filled with the chatter of café patrons and the clatter of streetcars, now lay shrouded in an oppressive silence. Shopkeepers had boarded up their windows, some scrawling, "Vive la France, long live France," on the wood planks before fleeing. At the Place de la Concorde, a group of elderly Parisians stood frozen, watching as German tanks rumbled past the Luxor obelisk, an icon of French pride now overshadowed by swastikas. Meanwhile, in London, de Gaulle's hands tightened around the script in his hands. He had fled France just days earlier, slipping out of Bordeaux with only 3 staff officers, 1 car, and less than £1,000 in funds. The radio studio was small, but his words would travel farther than he could have imagined, reaching French soldiers hiding in Normandy's fields, civilians sneaking underground newspapers in Lyon, and colonial troops stationed in North Africa. As the mist over the Seine began to lift, a young French girl named Marie clung to her mother's hand on the outskirts of Paris. She had left her doll in their apartment, but her mother had pressed a small tricolor pin into her palm. "This is for when we come back," her mother whispered. Nearby, a German soldier tossed a piece of bread to a stray dog, his boot crunching on a discarded French flag. It was a month of contradictions, a capital surrendered, yet a people unbroken, a government bent to defeat, yet a general refusing to yield. The morning of June 14, 1940, would go down in history not just as the day Paris fell, but as the day a new fight for France began, one that would spread from London's airwaves to the fields of North Africa, from Paris underground cellars to the beaches of Normandy 4 years later. For now, though, the Eiffel Tower stood silent, its iron beams bearing the weight of a Nazi flag. But in London, de Gaulle leaned closer to the microphone, his voice steady: "The flame of resistance must never be extinguished. We will fight on, until France is free again." The collapsing defense line, the final 48 hours of France's surrender. On June 16, 1940, dark clouds hung low over Bordeaux. In the underground command post of the French Prime Minister's official residence on the outskirts of the city, the air felt heavier than the gloomy weather outside. In the corridors, staff officers hurried past, arms loaded with stacks of urgent battle reports. On each sheet, red arrows pointed to the same direction. German troops were closing in from the north, east, and south, with the vanguard having reached the banks of the Loire River, a mere 200 kilometers from Bordeaux. When the door to the underground meeting room swung open, 78-year-old Marshal Philippe Pétain was seated on a leather sofa, his fingers unconsciously brushing the armrest. This man, once hailed as the savior of France for his role in the Battle of Verdun during World War I, now had no victory dispatches spread before him, only a copy of the armistice terms sent by the German High Command, its edges crumpled from his tight grip. "Marshal, this is the troop status report just submitted by General Vichy." An aide-de-camp placed a thin document on the table, his voice soft as if fearing to disturb the silence. The figures on the page were shocking. Of the 117 divisions the French army had initially fielded, 94 had been lost after 6 weeks of fierce fighting. Of the remaining 23 divisions, 17 were understrength by more than 40%, with each averaging just 6,000 men, less than half their full complement. The Germans had captured 3,000 field guns and 4,000 tanks, stockpiled ammunition was only enough to sustain combat for 3 more days. Of the Air Force's 430 fighter planes, merely 87 remained airworthy. Pilots had fought continuously for 72 hours, some even dozing off in their cockpits. When Pétain flipped to the last page, he saw a line of small handwriting next to General de Gaulle's signature: "No more usable troops, no more strength to fight." The meeting room door opened again, and Interior Minister Georges Mandel strode in, clutching a map of France's North African colonies, his tone urgent: "We cannot surrender. There are still 120,000 garrison troops in French North Africa. The ports of Morocco and Algeria can accommodate warships. We can relocate the government to Algiers and continue the fight alongside Britain." He spread the map on the table, pointing to Algiers. "From here, we can cut off Germany's supply lines in North Africa, even launch a counterattack against Italy." Relocate to Algiers? Navy Minister François Darlas scoffed, his finger tracing the Mediterranean on the map. "Have you forgotten the German U-boats? In the first half of June, 5 of our transport ships have been sunk by U-boats in the Mediterranean, with 12,000 tons of supplies going to the bottom of the sea. Now even the shipping route from Bordeaux to Algiers is blockaded by the Germans. How do you propose we transport the government and troops there?" He paused, pulling out a list of civilian ships. Only 12 civilian cargo ships remain in Bordeaux harbor. The largest has a cargo capacity of just 5,000 tons, barely enough to carry half the government personnel, let alone weapons and food. Mandel tried to argue, but Pétain raised a hand to cut him off. The elderly marshal stood slowly, his voice hoarse. "At Verdun in 1916, we held the line with sheer will, but this is different." He walked to the window, gazing at the grey sky outside. Paris has already been declared an open city. 1.5 million Parisians are fleeing. Highways are jammed with cars and horse-drawn carts. Some families have been traveling for 3 days and still haven't left the Paris suburbs. If we keep fighting, the Germans will bomb every city to the ground, killing more civilians. He turned around, his eyes sweeping over the cabinet members present. "I propose to the French people that we stop fighting, not surrender, but to preserve France's spark." Meanwhile, in the Normandy countryside, 32-year-old French Army Second Lieutenant Jean Moreau was hiding in an abandoned farmhouse with 12 soldiers. The farmhouse windows were boarded up, with only thin slits letting in faint light. The soldiers huddled around the fireplace, their faces caked in mud, their uniforms torn in several places. Moreau's rifle leaned against the corner, his father's name carved into the stock. His father, a World War I veteran, had lost his right leg at the Battle of Verdun in 1916. Before his death the previous winter, he had held Moreau's hand and said, "At no point is surrender more shameful than death." "Lieutenant," the radio's playing Marshal Pétain's speech again. Private Lewis held an old transistor radio to his ear, his voice trembling. "He says, we must stop fighting and negotiate with Germany." Moreau's head snapped up. He walked to the radio, just in time to hear Pétain's voice: "To avoid more bloodshed, to protect France's culture and people, we must accept reality." He slammed the radio off, his fist pounding the table so hard that a nearby enamel cup clattered. Reality? Reality is our cities being occupied, our people being oppressed. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. When unfolded, it revealed a crude map of the English Channel. I asked the farmhouse owner. He said there's a fishing boat in a nearby village that can sail out to sea. The captain is his nephew, and he's willing to take us to Britain. The soldiers exchanged glances. Lewis whispered, "But Lieutenant, we only have 30 rounds of ammunition left. What if we run into German patrols on the way? And will Britain even take us in?" "I don't know," Moreau replied, picking up his rifle from the corner and checking the chamber. "But I do know, if we stay here, we'll either be captured or killed. Going to Britain gives us at least a chance. I've heard General Charles de Gaulle is in London. He says we must keep fighting. Let's find him." That night, under the cover of darkness, Moreau led the soldiers toward the fishing village. The country lanes were muddy, and they stumbled forward, pausing every so often to listen for sounds of danger, terrified of encountering German patrols. Halfway there, car headlights appeared in the distance. Moreau quickly ordered everyone to hide in the roadside wheat field. They watched as 3 German motorcycles roared past, their headlights sweeping over the wheat. Each soldier held their breath, afraid to make a sound. Only after the motorcycles had faded into the distance did they dare to emerge and continue. One young soldier, Pierre, was so nervous that he stepped into a puddle, soaking his shoes, but he didn't utter a word, he just clung tightly to the formation. At the same time, in Bordeaux's government building, preparations for surrender were moving at a frantic pace. At 2 a.m. on June 17, Foreign Minister Paul Baudouin, accompanied by an interpreter, boarded a train bound for the Campine forest in Germany, a site chosen deliberately by Hitler for the armistice negotiations, as it was where Germany had surrendered to France in 1918, a deliberate act of humiliation. On the train, Baudouin stared at the trees racing past the window, his copy of the armistice terms soaked with sweat. Each clause felt like a knife. Germany would occupy northern France and the Atlantic coast directly, covering 80% of France's mainland, including all industrial zones and ports. France would pay Germany 400 million francs in occupation costs every month, equivalent to 1/3 of France's pre-war annual fiscal revenue. The French army would be reduced to just 100,000 men. Forbidden from possessing heavy weapons like tanks or aircraft, French Navy warships would be moored at designated ports, under German supervision, and barred from sailing. By 8 a.m., the train arrived at the Campine Forest's Armistice Railway carriage, the very same carriage where Germany had signed its 1918 surrender. Now redecorated by the Germans, a Nazi flag fluttered outside, and Hitler stood at the carriage door, a sneer on his face. The negotiations lasted a mere 3 hours. Baudouin had almost no room to bargain. When he signed the armistice agreement, his fingers trembled uncontrollably. When news of the signing reached Bordeaux, Pétain was walking in the official residence garden. Upon hearing the news, he stopped, gazing at a nearby rose bush, and whispered, "It ends here. At least France remains." By then, Moreau and his soldiers had reached the fishing village. The captain, Jacques, a fisherman in his 50s, his face etched by years of sea wind, looked at the exhausted soldiers and said without hesitation, "My boat is called L'Espérance, the Hope. We'll set sail at 3 a.m., during high tide. German patrol boats rarely come out at this hour." He brought the soldiers bread and water, and even found them fishing clothes to change into. "If we run into patrol boats, this will let you pass as fishermen." At 3 a.m., L'Espérance slipped quietly out of the village harbor. Moreau stood at the stern, watching France's coastline fade into the darkness. Some soldiers leaned against the hull, asleep, others stared toward Britain in the distance. Waves crashed against the boat, splashing water on their clothes, but no one cared. Louis pulled a slip of paper from his pocket, on which he had written the Chinese character for freedom, with charcoal before leaving the farmhouse. He held the paper up, whispering the word under the faint starlight, freedom. On the morning of June 18, as the Pétain government officially announced via radio that France accepts Germany's armistice terms, Moreau and his soldiers finally arrived at Britain's Dover harbor. On the pier, British soldiers were inspecting every person disembarking. When Moreau said, "We need to find General de Gaulle," a British officer pointed to a car nearby. "The general's office is in London, I can help you contact him." Moreau walked toward the car, glancing back at the English Channel, its surface glistening in the sunlight. He touched the old pocket watch his father had left him. It was still ticking, just like the faith in his heart. No matter how hard things got for France, one day, they would return. In London, at that very moment, General Charles de Gaulle stood in a BBC radio studio, speaking into a microphone, the words that would soon echo across the world: "France is not defeated. We will continue to fight, whether on French soil or overseas. We will liberate our motherland." On that day, two contrasting chapters of France's fate were written on either side of the English Channel. On one side, the compromise of the Pétain government, on the other, the perseverance of soldiers like Moreau and General de Gaulle. It was this perseverance that would become the hope of France's rebirth in the 4 years to come. Paris under the Iron Heel, the 48 hours after occupation. At 5 a.m. on the morning of June 14, 1940, the Seine River in Paris was still shrouded in a pale blue mist. The riverboats that once plied its waters had long been moored, and only a few wild ducks skimmed the surface, leaving tiny ripples in their wake. Suddenly, the sound of tidy footsteps echoed in the distance, not the familiar patrol rhythm of French soldiers that Parisians knew, but the clatter of German military boots on cobblestones, heavy, dense, and pounding like a hammer on the hearts of every Parisian still half asleep. By 7:30 a.m., the vanguard of the German 2nd Panzer Division had reached the Place de la Concorde. The tank tracks rumbled over the base of the obelisk in the center of the square, with clods of dirt from Normandy's countryside still clinging to the gaps between the treads. The cafés around the square kept their shutters drawn, but some people peeked through the slits. German soldiers, holding Nazi flags, marched along the square's circular path. The swastika on the flags unfurled in the morning breeze, standing in jarring contrast to the remains of the guillotine, an icon of the French Revolution, nearby. An elderly man with white hair stood on the street corner, leaning on a cane. When he saw the flags, he slowly removed his hat and pressed his trembling hands to his chest. Having lived through the Franco-Prussian War and World War I, tears now rolled down his wrinkled cheeks and dripped onto his dusty leather shoes. At 8 a.m. sharp, the German column entered the Champs-Élysées. Leading the way was an open-top jeep carrying General von Scholz, commander of the 2nd Panzer Division. He wore a crisp dark green military uniform and a gold-braided cap, a haughty smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Behind the jeep followed 12 Panzer IV tanks, their gun barrels pointing skyward and white crosses painted on their hulls. Further back came infantry formations, soldiers shouldering Mauser rifles, their steps so perfectly synchronized they felt suffocating. The Vive la France, Long Live France, banners that had hung above the shop doorways along the avenue were roughly torn down by German soldiers, some were shredded into pieces that fluttered to the ground, only to be crushed into the dirt by tank tracks. 9-year-old Marie Lemerle, holding her mother's hand, hid in an apartment building beside the Champs-Élysées and looked down from a second-floor window. She clutched a cloth doll, a gift her father had brought back from a business trip to Marseille the previous year. Her father, now a soldier in the French 12th Infantry Division, had vanished without a trace since the Dunkirk evacuation. "Mom, why are those soldiers tearing down our banners?" Marie whispered. Her mother pulled her into a hug and covered her eyes. "Don't ask. We'll stay indoors as much as possible from now on." That morning, Marie watched a young man rush into the street, pick up a tattered piece of banner, and shout, "Get out of Paris," at the German soldiers. 2 soldiers immediately pinned him against a wall and dragged him away. She never saw him again. At noon, the Germans held an occupation ceremony beneath the Arc de Triomphe. General von Scholz stood under the archway, accepting salutes from his soldiers. Behind him stood groups of Parisians, forced at gunpoint to watch the ceremony in the square. After the ceremony, the Germans posted notices across Paris, written in both German and French. Parisians must abide by the following rules. 1. A curfew will be imposed after 8 p.m. daily, violators will be shot on the spot. 2. Gatherings of more than 3 people are prohibited, and the spread of unauthorized information is forbidden. 3. All Jews must register with the police within 3 days and are barred from public places such as parks, cafés, and cinemas. 4. Concealing weapons is prohibited, violators will be executed. At Leroy's Bakery, located near Notre Dame Cathedral, the owner Jacques Leroy stared at the notice, forgetting to knead the dough in his hands. He had run the bakery for 20 years, his father had passed it down to him, saying, "Bread is the life of Parisians." But now, the Germans' material control order was posted at his shop door. Each citizen could buy only 200 grams of bread per day, plus 50 grams of butter and 30 grams of sugar per week, and only with a ration card. German soldiers, however, could use military vouchers to buy unlimited bread, meat, and even red wine. At 10 a.m., 3 German soldiers walked into the bakery and spoke in broken French, 10 baguettes, 5 kilograms of butter. Jacques pointed to the ration notice and explained softly, citizens can only buy 200 grams. Before he could finish, one soldier slammed the butt of his rifle on the counter and roared, "Cut the crap. This is for the soldiers of the Reich, how dare you refuse?" Jacques swallowed his anger, wrapped up the bread and butter, and watched them stride out. That 5 kilograms of butter would have been enough for 100 citizens to last a week. At 2 p.m., Jacques' neighbor, 72-year-old Madame Monique, arrived at the bakery leaning on a cane. She clutched her ration card and spoke in a hoarse voice, "Jacques, could you spare an extra 50 grams of bread? My grandson hasn't had enough to eat in 2 days." Madame Monique's son, a French soldier, had been captured and detained in a German concentration camp, leaving her to care for her 7-year-old grandson Pierre alone. Jacques looked at her wrinkled face, his heart aching. He pulled a small loaf of bread from under the counter and slipped it into her hand. "Don't let the Germans see you, take it home quickly." Madame Monique burst into tears, repeating, "Thank you," over and over. That afternoon, Jacques gave extra bread to 3 other neighbors like Madame Monique, further depleting his bakery's stock. At 6 p.m., as Jacques was about to close the shop, he heard a faint rustle in the backyard. Grabbing a rolling pin from the corner, he crept around to investigate, only to find a young man in a French military uniform huddled in the corner. The man's left arm was wrapped in a blood-stained bandage, and his face was pale. "Who are you?" Jacques asked warily. The young man looked up, his voice weak. "My name is Paul Dupont. I'm a soldier in the French 5th Infantry Division. Our company was scattered while resisting on the outskirts of Paris. I was shot, so I had to hide here." Jacques looked at the soldier's uniform, then at his wounded arm, and made a decision. He helped Paul into the bakery's cellar, found clean cloths and iodine, and re-bandaged his wound. The cellar was dark, lit only by a kerosene lamp. Jacques brought bread and water from the shop and handed them to Paul. "Stay here for now, until the danger passes." Paul took the bread and ate ravenously, tears falling onto the crust. "There were 120 men in our company. Now I'm the only one left. Our captain told me to survive, no matter what, wait for the day France is liberated." Jacques patted his shoulder. "We will. We'll all wait for that day." That night, Jacques didn't dare go home. He stayed in the cellar with Paul, listening to him talk about the fighting on the outskirts of Paris, how their company had ambushed German troops on a Seine bridge, using hand grenades to destroy a tank, only to be targeted by German bombers. Most of the company had been killed, and Paul had escaped by jumping into the river. At 7 a.m. on June 15, Paris's streets were even quieter than the day before. Only German patrol cars cruised back and forth, their loudspeakers blaring in French on a loop. All citizens must register on time. Hiding French soldiers is prohibited. Informants will be rewarded, those who harbor soldiers will be punished equally. Jacques emerged from the cellar and had just opened the bakery door when he saw a group of German soldiers gathered in front of the apartment building across the street. A woman's cries drifted over, and later, he learned that a resident in that building had hidden a wounded French soldier. Betrayed by a neighbor, both the soldier and the resident had been taken away by the Germans, never to return. At 10 a.m., the German Paris Governorate was officially established, housed in a luxurious villa next to the Élysée Palace. The governor was German General Otto von Stülpnagel. The Governorate issued a new order: all Parisian newspapers must be censored by the Germans before publication. With any anti-German content banned, the University of Paris was closed, and students were required to register at designated German offices. Museums such as the Louvre were shut down, with German troops sent to protect cultural relics. In reality, the Germans had already begun secretly inventorying the museum's priceless artifacts, preparing to ship them back to Germany. Near his bakery, Jacques saw people distributing the German-approved newspaper Le Journal de Paris, Paris Evening News, whose front-page headline read, "German-French Cooperation to Build a New European Order." He didn't dare take a copy and turned back into his shop. At noon, Paul heard the sound of German footsteps outside the cellar. Terrified, he scrambled into a corner beyond the kerosene lamp's glow. Jacques peeked through a crack in the door and saw 2 German soldiers lingering outside the bakery. His heart raced, but luckily, the soldiers only glanced around before walking away. Once they were gone, Jacques let out a sigh of relief and returned to the cellar. "Don't make a sound during the day," he told Paul. "I'll bring you food." Paul nodded and pulled a crumpled copy of the History of the French Revolution from his arms. "I took this from the company library," he said. "When I have nothing to do, I read it, think about those who fought for freedom." At 3 p.m., when Jacques went to buy flour, he found a long line outside the flour shop. The owner explained that the Germans had requisitioned most of the flour, leaving only a third of the usual supply for citizens. Jacques waited in line for 2 hours before buying 10 kilograms of flour, barely enough to keep his bakery running for 3 days. While waiting, he overheard 2 men whispering in line, "I heard General de Gaulle is calling for resistance in London." "Is that true?" "Don't talk about that, you'll be in trouble if the Germans hear you." Jacques felt a flicker of hope and silently memorized the name, de Gaulle. Half an hour before curfew at 6 p.m., a light rain suddenly fell on Paris's streets. The rain soaked the German notices, blurring the words printed on them. Jacques stood at the bakery door, watching the rainy streets. He thought of Paul in the cellar, of Madame Monique and her grandson, of the citizens taken away by the Germans. He didn't know how long these dark days would last, but he knew that as long as there were people still holding on, still refusing to give up, Paris would never truly fall. That night, Jacques wrote a line in his bakery's account book, June 15, 1940. Light rain. Gave Paul bread and water. Flour enough for 3 more days. Hope remains. In the cellar, Paul took advantage of the kerosene lamp's light to write on the title page of the History of the French Revolution, "For freedom, never give up." The rain continued to fall, and the Seine River flowed quietly in the darkness. But in the hearts of these ordinary people, Paris's resistance had already quietly taken root. The spark in London, de Gaulle and the birth of Free France. On June 18, 1940, London was shrouded in the shadow of German air raids. At 10 a.m., a shrill air raid siren cut through the sky. Citizens hurried to take shelter in subway stations, and Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square was covered in canvas to protect it from shrapnel damage. Meanwhile, in a small recording studio at the BBC Broadcasting House, 49-year-old General Charles de Gaulle was making final adjustments to the microphone. He wore a crisp French Army Major General's uniform, with the gold stars on his shoulder strap standing out sharply in the dim light. His left hand tightly clutched a manuscript filled with French text, its pages, marked by repeated revisions, had frayed edges. "General, BBC senior management is still worried that airing your speech will anger Germany and threaten Britain's domestic security." John Reed, head of the BBC French service, stood aside, his tone hesitant. At the time, Britain had just emerged from the chaos of the Dunkirk evacuation, having lost nearly 100,000 troops in the army. Fewer than 400 Spitfire fighters remained in the Air Force. The Churchill government was fully focused on defending against Germany's potential Operation Sea Lion landing, and was indeed reluctant to provoke Germany further. De Gaulle looked up, his gaze firm as he met Reed's eyes. "I am not provoking Germany. I am telling the French people they still have a choice, to resist, not to surrender." He pointed to a line in the manuscript. "The flame of French resistance will never be extinguished. This sentence must be broadcast. Even if only one French person hears it, it will be hope." Reed looked at the resolve in de Gaulle's eyes, recalling how 12,000 French soldiers had died covering the British evacuation at Dunkirk. Finally, he nodded. "We will air it after the 3 p.m. French news. It will be 5 minutes long." During the noon break, de Gaulle returned to his temporary residence in London, a small apartment in Kensington, furnished with only a bed, a table, and 2 chairs. Several suitcases filled with documents were piled in the corner. His wife Yvonne and their 3 children were still in France, and since he had fled Bordeaux by plane to Britain on June 17, he had received no news of his family. He sat at the table and wrote a short letter to his wife, "I am fighting for France here. Trust me, we will be reunited eventually." After finishing the letter, he had no idea where to send it, so he carefully folded it and tucked it into the inside pocket of his uniform. At 2:50 p.m., de Gaulle entered the BBC recording studio again. By then, his only 3 staff officers were standing in the corridor outside the studio: 28-year-old Alain de Bossu, 32-year-old Philippe Leclerc, and 30-year-old Jacques Sustel. These were the entire team de Gaulle had brought from France. Each carried a simple bag, ready to face danger at any moment. "General, we have contacted 12 French officers in London, and they are willing to join us," de Bossu reported in a low voice, a hint of excitement in his tone. At 3 p.m. sharp, the music marking the end of the French news played. De Gaulle took a deep breath and spoke into the microphone, "Fellow Frenchmen, this is Charles de Gaulle. No matter what happens, the flame of French resistance must not be extinguished, and it will never be extinguished." His voice was tense at first, but gradually grew impassioned as he spoke. He mentioned the soldiers' perseverance on the beaches of Dunkirk, the unyielding spirit of citizens on the streets of Paris, and the vast lands of France's colonies. "We can return from overseas, we can unite with our allies. We will eventually fight our way back to Paris." After the recording, de Gaulle walked out of the studio. The clock in the corridor showed 3:05 p.m. He had no way of knowing how many people in France were listening to the speech at that moment. In a small tavern in Lyon, baker Jacques Leroy huddled around a radio with a few friends, and when they heard the words, "Flame of Resistance," someone quietly wiped away tears. At the port of Marseille, fisherman Pierre Dupont turned off the engine of his boat, which he had been about to take out to sea, and squatted on the ground, carving the words, "Free France," into his oar. In the early morning of June 19, de Gaulle received a call from Prime Minister Churchill's office, inviting him to a meeting at 10 Downing Street that afternoon. This was their first official meeting. A large map of Europe during World War I hung in Churchill's office, and the latest war reports were spread out on his desk. German troops had fully occupied northern France and were preparing to sign an armistice agreement with the Pétain government. "General, your speech has caused quite a stir in Britain, but we need to know, what exactly can Free France do?" Churchill sat in his large leather chair, his fingers tapping the desk, his tone questioning. De Gaulle took a prepared plan out of his briefcase. "First, we need to recruit soldiers who have fled France and build a resistance force. Second, we need to contact garrisons in French colonies and win their support. Third, we need material aid from Britain, weapons, ammunition, and funds." He opened the second page of the plan, which listed specific figures. There are currently about 4,000 French soldiers in Britain, 3,000 of whom are from the Dunkirk evacuation. They have combat experience and can be deployed after minimal training. Churchill picked up the plan and read it carefully. When he saw the note stating 12,000 French soldiers killed at Dunkirk, he paused his tapping. Britain will not forget the sacrifice of French soldiers at Dunkirk. He looked up at de Gaulle. "We can provide 5,000 Lee Enfield rifles, 200 Bren light machine guns, 30 25-pounder field guns, and allocate £1 million in funding per month. Additionally, we will set up a training base in Ashford, Kent, for Free France to use." On June 22, news that France had signed an armistice agreement with Germany in the Campine Forest reached London. That afternoon, de Gaulle held Free France's first recruitment ceremony at the Ashford training base. The tents at the base were not yet fully set up, so soldiers sat on the grass to listen to de Gaulle's speech. Jean Laporte, 28, stood at the front of the crowd leaning on a crutch. His left arm had been hit by shrapnel during the fighting at Dunkirk. He had just undergone surgery, and his bandage was still losing blood. "I lost my left arm at Dunkirk, but I still have my right arm, and I can still hold a gun." Laporte raised his right hand and shouted. The crowd erupted in loud applause. André Dupuy, 35, was a French Air Force pilot. On June 20, he had flown a Morane-Saulnier fighter from mainland France to Britain. The plane's wings still bore bullet holes from German anti-aircraft fire. I saw German troops requisitioning our planes at the airfield in southern France. I couldn't let them be used to bomb French people, Dupuy told the soldiers beside him. He had brought intelligence on German Air Force deployments in southern France and later became one of the first commanders of Free France's Air Force. Daily life at the training base was full of challenges. At 6 a.m., soldiers began physical training, running 5 kilometers around the base, followed by bayonet practice and shooting drills. Due to the language barrier, British instructors could only teach using hand gestures and simple French words, which sometimes led to misunderstandings. When an instructor said, "Prone. Lie down," the soldiers thought he meant, "Boyer. Drink," and only understood when they saw the instructor drop to the ground. During afternoon tactics classes, Laporte became an ad hoc teacher. He used twigs to draw tactical maps on the ground and explained his defensive experience at Dunkirk. When German tanks approach, use the terrain for cover. Wait until the tanks pass, then throw incendiary bottles from the side to attack the joints of the tracks. Marie Lemerle, 22, was a nurse. She had saved nearly 100 wounded soldiers at a temporary hospital in Dunkirk and later arrived in Britain on an evacuation ship. After Free France was established, she volunteered to join and took charge of medical training for the soldiers. On the battlefield, every second counts. You need to learn how to bandage wounds quickly and how to stop bleeding from gunshot wounds. Holding a bandage, Marie demonstrated on a soldier's arm. The bandage should be tight enough to be effective but not so tight that it cuts off blood circulation. On June 28, the Free France Committee was formally established, with de Gaulle as chairman. Its members included experts in military, diplomatic, and financial fields. That night, the committee held its first meeting in a tent at the base. The light of a kerosene lamp flickered, casting shadows on everyone's faces. We currently have 4,000 soldiers, 10 aircraft, and 5 small ships, but this is not enough, de Gaulle said, looking at a map of France on the wall. We need to contact resistance groups in mainland France and let them know they are not fighting alone. Soustelle was in charge of diplomatic liaison. On the same day, he sent telegrams to the commanders of garrisons in French colonies, explaining the situation of Free France. General Diouf, commander of the garrison in French Cameroon, his nephew died at Dunkirk. We can start with him, Soustelle said. He planned to send an envoy to Cameroon with the nephew's personal effects to win Diouf's support. Late at night, de Gaulle sat alone in his tent, watching the lights of the training base. In the distance, he could hear soldiers singing France's national anthem, La Marseillaise. He took the letter to his wife out of his pocket, read it again, and carefully tucked it back. We are few now, but we have the entire French people behind us, he whispered to the night sky outside the tent, as if speaking to his family far away, and to himself. We will return eventually, to Paris, to the land that is ours. By then, the air raid siren had sounded again in London. German bombers dropped bombs in the distance, and the rumble of explosions could be faintly heard. But at the Ashford training base, the soldiers' singing did not stop. The melody of La Marseillaise echoed through the night, like a spark, growing brighter and brighter in the darkness. This was the spark of Free France, and the hope of France's rebirth. From spark to blaze, the early resistance of Free France. In Lyon, July 1940, the morning market at 5 a.m. was still damp with dew. Jean Laporte pushed a blue-painted bread cart, moving slowly between the stalls. Stacked in the cart were freshly baked baguettes, their wheat aroma mingling with the cool dawn air. But no one knew that hidden in the interlayer of the bottom bread basket was intelligence wrapped in oiled paper, gathered the night before by him and 3 members of the intelligence station in the basement of an abandoned factory. It detailed German troop movements. 20 tanks of the 17th Panzer Division would pass through Lyon railway station in 3 days. En route to Toulouse in the south, the suburban arsenal would receive 50 tons of ammunition every Wednesday afternoon, guarded by only 12 soldiers. Laporte's cover identity was a delivery boy for Madame Marie's Bakery, a stronghold specially rented by the resistance. The owner, 60-year-old Madame Marie, had lost her son in the Battle of Dunkirk. When she learned of Laporte's plan, she volunteered, "Use the bakery to cover you. Every day at 3 a.m., Madame Marie would bake bread in advance, and Laporte would deliver the intelligence to contact points across Lyon while making his rounds, some hidden under the bar of a café, others in hollowed-out book covers labeled Hugo's Poems, on bookstore shelves, and still more among piles of fabric in a tailor's shop. On July 12, Laporte went to deliver intelligence to a café in the Saint-Antoine district as planned. He had just slipped the oiled paper into a hidden compartment under the bar when 3 German soldiers walked in. They ordered beer and sat by the window. One soldier noticed Laporte's bread cart and asked in broken French, "How much for the bread?" Laporte forced calm, smiling as he handed over a baguette, freshly baked, "For you, free." The soldier took the bread, then suddenly lifted the bread baskets in the cart. Laporte's heart jumped to his throat instantly. Fortunately, Madame Marie had sewn the intelligence compartment into the basket bottom. The soldier rummaged through the top layer of bread, found nothing suspicious, muttered, "No butter," and let him go. By the time Laporte pushed the cart out of the café, the clothes on his back were soaked with cold sweat. He ducked into an alley, leaned against a wall, and gasped for breath, still clutching an uneaten baguette, its tooth marks clear to see. Such close calls were common in the intelligence station's operations. To expand the network, Laporte recruited 28-year-old schoolteacher Suzanne. She taught at Lyon's 3rd primary school, and many of her students were children of German officers. Through casual chats with their parents, she easily obtained information like German troop rotation times and officers' names. Once, Suzanne learned the Germans planned to search residential areas near the school on the weekend. She immediately wrote the warning on a slip of paper, tucked it into a student's graded homework, and had a resistance courier pick it up posing as a parent. Using such everyday delivery methods, the intelligence station sent out 47 pieces of key intelligence between July and September. One set of blueprints for the initial construction of the German Atlantic Wall was later classified as highest priority by Allied headquarters, directly used to plan breakthrough points for the future D-Day landings. As resistance activities on the mainland shifted from intelligence gathering to small-scale sabotage, Free France's colonial sparks were also quietly spreading. In August 1940, de Gaulle sent Major Henri Ayraud as an envoy to French Cameroon, now Cameroon, tasked with persuading local garrison commander General Mohamed Diouf to break away from the Vichy government and swear allegiance to Free France. Before departing, Major Ayraud took with him the personal effects of Diouf's nephew, a rusted French military dog tag and half a letter dated May 28, 1940. The nephew, a soldier in the French 12th Infantry Division, had died defending Lille during the Dunkirk evacuation. The last line of his letter read, "Uncle, I will hold this position until my last breath." When Major Ayraud met General Diouf at Cameroon's Douala-Port, the 50-year-old general was staring blankly at the French military flag on the wall. The Vichy government had already sent an order demanding he disarm all soldiers opposing surrender, but he had delayed executing it. Ayraud handed over the personal effects. Diouf picked up the dog tag, running his fingers repeatedly over the name engraved on it, his eyes gradually reddening. "My nephew was only 21 when he died," he said, his voice choking. "The Vichy government says surrender is for France, but this France is not what he died to defend." That afternoon, General Diouf gave a speech in Douala's Garrison Square. In front of 2,000 soldiers, he tore up the Vichy order: "From today, all garrisons in French Cameroon swear allegiance to Free France. We will avenge our comrades who died at Dunkirk, we will make France free again." The soldiers erupted in cheers, many raised their rifles, shouting, "Vive la France libre! Long live Free France!" French Cameroon's defection sent ripples across the colonies. In September, General Félix Ebou, commander of French Equatorial Africa, now Chad, the Republic of the Congo, and the Central African Republic, declared allegiance to Free France. Ebou, an African Frenchman, had long opposed the Vichy government's racist policies. He not only brought his garrison into the fold but also persuaded local tribal chiefs to offer support. Tribal members used traditional spears and bows to patrol alongside French soldiers, preventing Vichy supporters from sabotaging supply lines. By October, garrisons in French West Africa's Senegal and Ivory Coast, now Côte d'Ivoire, had also joined. Free France's colonial troop strength grew from 4,000 to 12,000, along with 20 old Morane-Saulnier fighters, 5 small gunboats, and 120 75mm field guns plus 3,000 rifles from colonial arsenals. Transporting these colonial resources to resistance fronts on the mainland or in North Africa posed enormous challenges. Chad, part of French Equatorial Africa, bordered Libya, where German submarines were deployed at Benghazi port, blocking Mediterranean shipping lanes. Free France's supplies had to be transported overland, starting from N'Djamena in Chad, crossing the Sahara Desert to Casablanca in Morocco, then onward to Britain or mainland resistance strongholds. This desert supply route stretched 2,800 kilometers, its surface covered in loose sand that often trapped vehicles. Daytime temperatures soared to 45 degrees Celsius, while nights dropped below 0 degrees Celsius. Supply team soldiers frequently repaired trucks under the scorching sun, drinking from water-filled goatskins and eating compressed biscuits when hungry. During one October transport, a convoy of 8 trucks encountered a sandstorm in the Sahara. 3 trucks got stuck, soldiers dug with their hands for 6 hours to free them. One soldier's hands were raw and bleeding, yet he laughed and said, "This is nothing compared to shrapnel at Dunkirk." In November, Free France fought its first real battle in North Africa. At the time, Rommel's German Africa Corps was preparing to attack Tobruk, held by British forces. Free France's 1st Colonial Brigade, 1,500 soldiers from French Cameroon and Chad, was ordered to assist the British with guerrilla operations in Cyrenaica, Libya. The brigade commander, 35-year-old Major Paul Leclerc, later commander of a Free French armored division, adopted mobile tactics honed at Dunkirk. He split the brigade into 10 small units of 150 men each, equipped with 2 mortars and 3 light machine guns, to operate near German supply lines. In the early morning of November 15, Leclerc led one unit in an ambush beside a desert highway, the main route for German ammunition transports. When a convoy of 30 German trucks approached, they detonated explosives buried under the road, destroying the lead truck. Mortars targeted the convoy's center, while light machine guns fired at German soldiers jumping from vehicles. The battle lasted an hour. Leveraging their familiarity with the desert terrain, Free French soldiers attacked and withdrew quickly, giving the Germans no chance to counterattack. The raid destroyed 12 German trucks, seized 5 tons of ammunition and 3,000 liters of gasoline, and captured 80 German soldiers. Among the prisoners was a 19-year-old German private who wept and said, "I don't want to fight, I want to go home." Leclerc had his men give the boy bread and water before handing him over to arriving British forces. By December, Free France's resistance network was taking shape, 12 intelligence stations on the mainland, spread across Lyon, Marseille, Toulouse, and other cities, with over 300 members, 5 colonial garrison strongholds with 12,000 troops, controlling most ports in French Africa. Britain provided a second round of weapons aid, 8,000 Lee Enfield rifles, 300 Bren light machine guns, 50 mortars, and 10 Morris armored cars. These weapons were shipped to resistance members via the desert supply route and British transport vessels. On Christmas Day, December 25, in London, General de Gaulle smiled faintly as he reviewed battle reports from across the region in Free France's small headquarters office. A cup of hot coffee sat on his desk, next to a map of Paris. He circled the Arc de Triomphe and Eiffel Tower in red ink, writing beside them, "This Christmas 1940, we resist, next Christmas, we will be one step closer to home." Snow fell outside in London, passers-by occasionally waved at the headquarters windows, they knew these French fighters were battling for freedom. In Lyon's bakery, Madame Marie, Laporte, and Suzanne distributed Christmas bread to resistance members. Hidden in each loaf was a small note with de Gaulle's words, "Resistance is not the fight of one person, but of all who love France." Laporte bit into his bread, savoring its warm wheat flavor. Looking at the snow outside, he thought, when spring comes, they would launch larger operations, each step bringing them closer to liberating Paris. From intelligence gathering in July, to railway sabotage in September, to desert raids in November, Free France's sparks grew into a blaze in the second half of 1940. These resistance fighters included frontline veterans, ordinary teachers, bakers, and fishermen. They had no advanced weapons or ample supplies, yet with the belief, never abandon France, they planted seeds of hope for Free France's future right under the enemy's nose. As General de Gaulle wrote in a reply to Laporte's intelligence station, every piece of intelligence, every act of sabotage, strikes a blow against the Nazis, every resistance member is a cornerstone of France's rebirth. The last ray of sunlight in June 1940 fell on the Nazi flag atop Paris' Eiffel Tower. The cold light reflected by the metal flagpole illuminated the sparse pedestrians on the Champs-Élysées. They huddled into their collars, hurrying past with heads bowed, daring not to meet the eyes of German soldiers in the street corner outposts. On that day, long lines formed outside Paris bakeries. Citizens clutched their ration coupons for limited supplies, their 200 grams of black bread growing warm in their hands. No one spoke, only the wind swept past the empty shop signs, carrying a touch of bleakness. Across the English Channel in London, in a small office adjacent to 10 Downing Street, General de Gaulle revised documents under a desk lamp. Spread out before him was Free France's recruitment list. Over a mere 10 days, the names on it had grown from an initial 3,000 to 4,000. Among them, 3,000 were French soldiers who had retreated from Dunkirk, and 1,000 were civilians who had fled mainland France. They included teachers, craftsmen, and even a 16-year-old apprentice. Next to each signature, a tiny fleur-de-lis, the symbol of France, was drawn. De Gaulle picked up a fountain pen and added his own name at the end of the list. The scratch of the nib against paper echoed sharply in the quiet room. At the same moment, in the cellar of the bakery beside Notre Dame Cathedral, Jacques Leroy handed a piece of warm bread to Paul. Paul's bandage on his left arm had just been replaced, and the copy of the History of the French Revolution he held to his chest was dog-eared from frequent reading. He pointed to the illustration of the storming of the Bastille, and whispered to Jacques, "Look, over 200 years ago, our ancestors also fought for freedom." Jacques nodded, then pulled a piece of oiled paper from the bottom of the bread basket. Scrawled on it in pencil was the location of a German arms depot, intelligence he had received from a customer that day. Early the next morning, someone would deliver it to Spain, and from there to Free France's headquarters in London. The sound of a German patrol car drifted in through the cellar's air vent. Both men held their breath until the car faded away, yet the light in their eyes never dimmed. In a narrow alley in Lyon, France, Jean Laporte had just delivered his last basket of bread to a café. He removed his flour-dusted cap, revealing a small scar behind his left ear, a memento from the fighting at Dunkirk. The café owner slipped him a note, on which was written that a German arms train would pass through Lyon railway station the next day. Laporte folded the note and tucked it into the inner pocket of his baker's apron, then vanished into the night. He knew this note might help the Allies blow up the train, even if it only delayed the German supply line, it would buy a little more time for France's liberation. June 1940 was the darkest month in modern French history. Paris fell, the government surrendered, 120,000 French soldiers were captured, 350,000 Jews faced the threat of persecution, and countless families were forced from their homes each day. Yet it was also the month when the spark of freedom was kindled amid despair, from London's radio broadcasts to Paris cellars, from Lyon's alleys to North African colonies, countless ordinary people resisted in their own ways. Jacques passed intelligence in bread baskets, Paul guarded his beliefs with a book, Laporte concealed his identity behind flour, and de Gaulle rallied strength with his voice. These sparks, though seemingly faint, gradually converged, from Free France's initial 400-strong resistance force in London to the 12,000 troops in North African colonies by the end of the year, from a single person passing intelligence in Lyon to the emerging underground resistance network in Paris. From soldiers hiding in fishing boats crossing the English Channel to recruits learning tactics at training bases in London. They were like stars scattered across the night sky, faint, yet illuminating France's path forward. Hitler thought occupying Paris meant conquering France, and signing an armistice meant extinguishing the flame of resistance. But he forgot the belief in freedom etched into the French soul, a belief that had never wavered, not during the 1789 revolution, the 1914 defense, or the 1940 resistance. The end of June 1940 was not France's finale, but the starting point of Free France's rise from despair. Years later, when people stand beside Paris' Arc de Triomphe, gazing at the fluttering French tricolor, they will remember those figures from June 1940, de Gaulle broadcasting from London, Jacques and Paul in the Paris cellar, Laporte in the Lion Alley, and countless unnamed resistors. With their courage and conviction, they prove that even if cities fall and governments surrender, a nation will never perish as long as the spark of freedom remains. As de Gaulle declared in his radio address back then, no matter what happens, the flame of French resistance must never be extinguished, and it will never be extinguished. And 4 years later, that flame would finally light up every street in Paris, and every inch of French soil.